The very first thing she shouted at me was, "You can't just walk in and claim that dock." I hadn't even figured out who she was yet. I'd barely set down my moving boxes when she stormed across my yard as if she owned the entire neighborhood, ranting about community rules and access rights. No greeting, no introduction, just raw entitlement. Like my property was some playground she didn't want me touching. And the little entourage trailing behind her with clipboards made it obvious something strange was going on. I bought this lakeside cabin because I was desperate for peace after 3 grueling years in the corporate grind. At 38, I was burnt out from managing logistics for a shipping company and wanted somewhere quiet to breathe again. The realtor had shown me this cabin one September afternoon, and I knew instantly it was the place. Weathered cedar siding, a stone fireplace, and best of all my own private pier stretching 50 feet into the crystal clear waters of Lake Harrison. The deal was simple, the inspection flawless, and I paid in cash straight from my retirement savings. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd made a good decision. Moving day started early. The morning air carried the scent of pine and lake water, such a relief after years of recycled office air. I had just carried in my first box when I noticed 3 strangers wandering down my pier as if it belonged to them. Through the kitchen window I saw a woman in her 50s, perfectly styled hair, waving around a stack of laminated papers. A stocky man in khakis followed, scribbling notes, while another board member whose name I forgot immediately trailed behind. At first I thought maybe they were neighbors stopping by to say hello, but their posture made it clear this wasn't a friendly visit. I stepped outside, still in my old moving clothes, unprepared for what was about to unfold. The woman locked eyes with me instantly and strode up the slope toward my porch with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. "You must be the new owner," she declared, her tone sharp rather than welcoming. "I'm Victoria Hale, president of the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your pier immediately." The man introduced himself as Clark Benson, the HOA's so-called enforcement officer. His smug grin made it obvious he was enjoying the power trip. The third person mumbled their introduction, but I barely heard. Ina too focused on what this group wanted from me. Victoria wasted no time. She launched into a rehearsed speech about community dock access and shared marina resources. According to her, my private pier was actually HOA property and I needed to hand it over right away for their new Marina Pass program. "We'll be selling seasonal access to residents for $200 each," she explained, as if that was a perfectly reasonable demand. Clark chimed in, warning that refusal would result in $50 daily fines, doubling overtime. I listened silently, though every word sounded more absurd than the last. Victoria shuffled through blurry photocopied documents, growing increasingly impatient when I refused to respond. Finally, she smirked and asked, "So, what's your answer?" I met her eyes calmly and said, "Can you show me the deed proving this pier belongs to the HOA?" Her expression cracked. Suddenly, she was talking about covenant interpretations and community standards instead of producing actual paperwork. Clark tried to intimidate me with threats of inspections and violation notices, but I simply repeated my question. I had spent a fortune on this place. I wasn't about to give away part of it because of some grainy photocopies and empty threats. When I pulled out my phone and started recording, their confidence faltered. Victoria protested about privacy and documentation, which was laughable considering they were trespassing on my dock, making demands. I told them plainly I'd need to see proper legal documents before discussing further. That ended the meeting. They retreated down my pier in a tight huddle, whispering, and casting glances back at my cabin. After they left, I stood on my porch trying to make sense of it. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out an old brass key the previous owner had handed me during closing. "You'll figure out what it opens," he had said with a knowing smile. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now, in the afternoon sun, I studied its tarnished metal and the strange symbols etched into it: an anchor, an arrow, and markings I didn't recognize. Why had the last owner kept this pier private for so many years if it truly belonged to the HOA? And why were they suddenly so desperate to take it from me? Something wasn't adding up. The next morning, at 5:30 sharp, pounding on my door woke me. Still groggy, I peeked through the peephole and saw Clark standing there, dressed in a tie and polished shoes like he was headed to court. In his hands was a stack of official papers. I cracked the door open just enough to take them, and he immediately launched into his speech about violations and inspections. The notices looked ridiculous: cheap clip art borders, amateur fonts, printed on plain copy paper. One citation claimed I had unauthorized signage because of the small private pier sign already there. Another accused me of failing to register watercraft access equipment, which seemed like a convoluted way of saying dock. The strangest violation of all was for non-compliance with community marina integration protocols, which sounded completely fabricated. Each citation carried a $50 daily fine, doubling weekly. When I asked where these so-called protocols were written, Clark simply tapped his briefcase as if that answered anything. But what unsettled me most wasn't the bogus paperwork, it was the realization that my neighbors might actually be involved in this. Since Victoria's little visit, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted noticeably. The woman in the blue cottage across the street, who used to wave every time she saw me, suddenly found her phone fascinating whenever I walked past. An older man who'd warmly introduced himself during my first week now avoided eye contact altogether. Conversations on porches seemed to cut off the moment I came into view. It didn't take long to figure out that Victoria had been busy spreading her own narrative around the community. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if there really was a coordinated effort to turn everyone against me, but either way, it was working. The whole experience felt like being back in high school again, except now the mean kids had clipboards, titles, and legal jargon on their side. Instead of wallowing in frustration, I decided to dig deeper. I opened my laptop, pulled up satellite imagery, and compared it with the county's official property maps. That's when something caught my attention: a misfiled boundary overlay. According to the county's data, my lot actually stretched farther into the lake than I'd originally realized. The official records didn't match Victoria's claims at all, and certainly didn't support her assertion that my pier was community property. I sketched out the dock's measurements, cross-checking them against the satellite view. The more I studied the discrepancies, the more certain I became that the HOA's version of the property lines was deliberately skewed. Needing to see things firsthand, I took a walk around my land. Following the tree line behind the cabin, I stumbled onto a narrow trail that led down to the water about 100 yards east of my pier. There, hidden in tall grass and cattails, was something remarkable: an old boundary marker, nearly swallowed by decades of overgrowth. The rusty post leaned at an angle, but etched into it were the same carved symbols I'd seen on the brass key the previous owner left me. I cleared away vines and weeds until the markings were visible. Without a doubt, the post lined up perfectly with my pier. I snapped photos from several angles and saved the GPS coordinates displayed on my phone. The symbols, an anchor, a key, and a compass-like figure, were hand-carved, not machine-made, and they looked far older than the HOA itself. As I studied the engravings, I remembered something Frank Morrison, the previous owner, had said at closing. He'd mentioned the HOA always resented him for reasons they could never prove. At the time, I brushed it off, but now, with the key in my pocket and the marker in front of me, I realized there was a deeper story here, one the HOA didn't want uncovered. On my way back, I ran into Harold Green, an older resident who lived near the entrance in one of the original cottages. Harold, probably in his 70s, had the weathered hands and tanned skin of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. He was pulling weeds in his garden when I passed, and after a cautious glance around, he greeted me quietly. "Morning, Derek," he said, voice low. "Heard you had some visitors yesterday." The way he said it made me think he'd witnessed the whole confrontation. Slowly, Harold shared bits and pieces of what he knew. According to him, the HOA had been bending property definitions for years, acclaiming private docks and access points as community amenities to justify extra fees. Used to be clear where private property ended and community land began, he explained, but Victoria's been a broken bar creative with her interpretations, especially near the water. He told me some homeowners had been pressured into giving up their private dock rights in exchange for a lower HOA dues. The Marina Pass idea wasn't new either, it had been whispered about for months. When I asked if anyone had ever challenged the HOA legally, Harold shook his head with the weary look of someone who'd seen too many people lose against them. The part that struck me most was his memory of Frank Morrison. Frank had lived in my cabin for over 30 years before moving to a retirement home. He had always maintained that his dock was outside the hose controller and claimed he had paperwork proving it, dating back to the original lake development in the 1960s. Harold recalled how Frank always carried an old brass key, insisting it symbolized something important about property rights here. When I mentioned Frank had left me a key, Harold's eyes widened. He urged me to look into the original property surveys and warned that Victoria had been particularly bitter about Frank's refusal to bend. My arrival, he suspected, was her chance to finally seize the pier she couldn't wrestle from him. In that moment, it became clear this wasn't about minor violations, it was about ownership. That suspicion was confirmed when I opened my mailbox Thursday afternoon. Inside was a formal notice, printed on whole letterhead, announcing a community standards review. My name appeared prominently under property violations. Victoria had wasted no time organizing what looked like a public trial. The language dripped with authority, framing the meeting as my inevitable downfall. It was scheduled for Saturday evening at the clubhouse, a rustic building with massive windows overlooking the Marina and directly facing my disputed pier. I spent Friday night combing through every document from my purchase, searching for anything that might shed light on the pier's legal status. But the deeper I looked, the more questions I found. By Saturday evening, the weather was unusually warm. Neighbors trickled toward the clubhouse in small groups, murmuring among themselves. When I arrived, the place was packed. Rows of chairs faced a long table where Victoria sat with 3 board members, their piles of paperwork spread out like weapons. Clark stationed himself by the entrance, clipboard in hand, playing security guard as he checked names off his list. The atmosphere felt less like a community gathering and more like a trial with me as the accused. I slipped into a seat near the back, trying to remain unnoticed, but conversations hushed as I walked past. Victoria opened the meeting with rehearsed authority, delivering a speech on cooperation and shared responsibility for waterfront resources. Then, her tone sharpened as she pivoted to me. What followed wasn't a discussion, it was a character assassination. She listed supposed violations and disruptions, painting me as a hostile newcomer determined to undermine the hose authority. According to her version of events, from the very moment she welcomed me, I had been combative and unwilling to cooperate. The most frustrating part of her presentation was how she twisted our past interactions, painting herself as calm and reasonable while portraying me as obstinate. She described her first visit to my cabin as a friendly attempt to explain community rules, leaving out the fact that she had demanded I hand over my property immediately without offering any legal proof. She even framed Clark's intimidating citation delivery as if it were nothing more than a standard administrative step, rather than the pressure tactic it was meant to be. When she wrapped up her list of grievances and opened the floor for comments, the mood in the room shifted uncomfortably. Residents were suddenly being asked to pick sides in a conflict many of them barely understood. A handful spoke up in her favor, repeating familiar lines about cooperation and shared responsibility. One woman complained that my refusal to allow pier access was keeping her grandchildren from enjoying the lake safely, an odd claim, considering the community had several other water entry points. An older gentleman voiced worries about property values falling if owners started restricting community amenities, though he couldn't explain how my private pier had ever been considered one. The entire exchange felt rehearsed, as if Victoria had spent the week coaching supporters on what to say and when to say it. I noticed Harold Green sitting quietly near the front, eyes fixed on his hands, deliberately avoiding participation. When Victoria finally turned the spotlight on me, asking if I had anything to add in my defense, I stood up slowly. I could have launched into a detailed explanation of property rights or dismantled every one of her half-truths. Instead, I chose a different approach. Victoria, I said, with a faint smile, I already asked you that question at my cabin, and I don't need to ask it again. Instead, I'll tell you what I've discovered since then. The room fell into silence. I explained, briefly, about my conversation with Harold and the inconsistencies in the property maps, carefully holding back my strongest evidence. I saw curiosity spark across the room, even among some who had echoed Victoria earlier. Where's the deed? Someone finally called out from the back. this time directing the question at her. Victoria stumbled through a vague explanation about covenant interpretations and community traditions, but the energy in the room had shifted. What began as a staged confrontation was now unraveling into an unsolved mystery, and the community wanted answers. I thanked everyone for their time and left, knowing my words had landed more sharply than I expected. Driving back to the cabin, though, doubt crept in. Victoria still held the advantage of her title and the loyalty of some residents, giving her a platform I couldn't match. Still, her desperate attempts to avoid producing real documentation told me there was more beneath the surface than a simple property dispute. Back home, I pulled up the photos of the boundary markers I'd taken earlier in the week. The GPS coordinates and carved symbols seemed like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. I had the strong sense that tomorrow would bring answers Victoria wouldn't want uncovered. Tomorrow, I would bring the one map that mattered, the waterline survey. That night, winter's first true cold front swept through. The wind roared across the lake, rattling my windows and making sleep impossible. I had spent much of the weekend digging into property law and trying to contact the survey company Harold had mentioned, but their office wouldn't reopen until Monday. Time felt like it was slipping away. Victoria's public spectacle on Saturday had clearly been intended to turn the community against me, and judging by the way neighbors avoided eye contact that morning, her plan was working. Sitting in my kitchen near midnight, poring over the title documents yet again, I heard faint footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought it was just an animal or maybe a branch scraping against the house. Then came the unmistakable sound of paper being slid under my door. I hesitated before checking. Something about the timing felt wrong. When I finally picked it up, I found a folded sheet with 5 chilling words scrawled in block letters: sell or regret it. Last warning. No name, no letterhead, just a threat that made the entire dispute suddenly personal and dangerous. I spent the next hour circling the cabin, checking windows and doors, acutely aware of just how isolated I was. The closest neighbor was hundreds of feet away, and with the wind howling through the pines, no one would hear a thing if something happened. I tried convincing myself it was just Clark's twisted idea of intimidation, but the anonymity suggested someone was willing to escalate far beyond hope politics. The following morning, I found both truck tires slashed cleanly with a knife. Reporting it to the sheriff only deepened my unease. The deputy who came out seemed more concerned with the HOA dispute than the vandalism itself. He implied this was the kind of conflict that sometimes spilled over and suggested I resolve the Pier issue before matters worsened. It was obvious Victoria's side of the story had already reached law enforcement. That night, lying awake in bed and contemplating whether I should just sell the place, I spotted beams of light moving around the dock. At least 2 figures were down there, shining flashlights across the pier, taking notes or photos. Watching through binoculars, I saw them spend nearly 20 minutes documenting the structure before heading back, and not toward nearby cabins, but directly toward the community center. This wasn't trespassing, it was an organized HOA inspection carried out in secret. By Thursday, the pressure escalated again. I received a certified letter from a county law firm threatening immediate legal action if I didn't stop interfering with community marina operations. The language was heavy with legal jargon about easements and access rights, but what stood out was the reference to a recent inspection citing supposed safety violations. The timing made it obvious. The midnight visitors at my dock hadn't been curious neighbors, they had been gathering evidence. It was beginning to feel like a carefully orchestrated campaign to drive me out completely. For a moment, I considered calling a realtor, but then I remembered something my father once told me about dealing with bullies: documentation beats confrontation every time. Instead of retreating, I decided to fight back. Friday morning, I called a lawyer friend from college, laid out the entire situation, and asked for her guidance. She agreed to review my documents over the weekend and promised to connect me with a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. She reminded me that no matter what civil disputes existed, anonymous threats and vandalism were still criminal acts, and that I should document everything in detail. The real turning point came Friday evening when my attorney friend finally called back with news that changed the entire situation. After carefully reviewing the boundary surveys and title records I had sent her, She uncovered something Victoria and the HOA board had clearly been hoping I'd never find. The original survey from the 1970s showed that my pier, along with the waterfront access area, was protected by an exclusive easement specifically for watercraft use and maintenance. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was straightforward. I alone held the rights to use and control that dock space. No one else could interfere without my explicit consent. Even more revealing was a clause about liability insurance and maintenance contracts, suggesting that my property was more integral to the Marina system than I had ever realized. That evening, with the sun sinking low, I walked to the end of my pier, the same spot where Victoria had first confronted me. The brass key in my pocket suddenly felt weightier, and the markings on the boundary posts began to connect in my mind like pieces of a puzzle. I snapped another picture of the lake, this time capturing the GPS coordinates and sight lines between my dock and the strange marker I had discovered earlier. Whatever Victoria was trying to bury, I was edging closer to uncovering it. Instead of breaking me, the late-night threats and intimidation had only fueled my determination. Something told me tomorrow would bring revelations that could flip this entire conflict upside down. My thought was simple: touch my pier, and you cut off your own access to the lake. By Saturday morning, I realized that staying on the defensive wasn't working. Victoria's scare tactics had been too effective, and the anonymous threats made it clear this fight was escalating with or without me. So rather than sit back and wait for the next round of citations, I decided to flip the script. If the HOA claimed this was about community access, then I'd let the community experience the pier themselves and decide who was really protecting their interests. I spent the afternoon preparing what I called an open dock event. I lined the pier with solar lights, set up a folding table with snacks and drinks, and hauled my portable grill down to the dock for an easy-going barbecue. The whole setup was warm, casual, and welcoming, the complete opposite of the rigid, intimidating aura that always seemed to follow Victoria. I even made simple flyers explaining my intent, to let neighbors enjoy the pier while also learning about the true property boundaries. I delivered one to every cabin except Victoria's and Clark's. The first to arrive was Megan Price, a single mom who lived near the community entrance with her 2 kids. She'd always struck me as someone barely making ends meet, and I knew the HOA's proposed marina fees would hit her family hard. Her kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, ran to the railing, wide-eyed as they watched fish darting around the pilings. "We've never actually been on a dock before," Megan admitted, watching them lean over excitedly. The HOA always made it sound like private piers weren't for families like ours. Seeing their wonder reminded me exactly why I was fighting this battle. Soon after, Megan found herself at the center of a heated conversation about HOA enforcement. "Clark told me my kayak rack was a safety hazard," she explained, looking straight at me. "They threatened me with weekly fines. I barely have space in my garage, and they won't let me store it anywhere else." Her frustration opened the floodgates. Other residents began sharing their own run-ins with Victoria's enforcement campaigns. One by one, stories poured out, and it became clear this had nothing to do with safety or aesthetics. It was about control. Harold Green eventually showed up with his quiet wife, both of them curious about the dock and how it tied into the Marina system. By early evening, at least 20 people had gathered on my pier. The atmosphere was friendly, neighborly, and genuinely the way I had always imagined living in a lake community would be. The conversation shifted naturally to the HOA's finances. Residents compared notes on fees and budgets, and a troubling pattern emerged. Victoria had been pushing a narrative about urgent marina repairs, claiming funds were needed to maintain safe access. Yet according to budget records, over $50,000 had already been collected for those exact repairs, and no one could recall seeing a single improvement. "The docks have been rotting for years," one boat owner complained. "We keep paying extra assessments, but nothing ever gets fixed. And now they want another $200 for marina passes, on top of dues?" That's when Megan stood tall, her children at her side, and raised her voice so it carried over the water. "Don't turn our marina into an ATM machine," she declared. "We already pay HOA dues for maintenance. We shouldn't be charged again just to access what we've already funded." Applause rippled across the pier as neighbors nodded in agreement. At that moment, It was clear this wasn't really about my dock at all. Victoria had been using it as a smokescreen to justify new fees that weren't being accounted for. The evening wound down around 9. That's when I noticed Clark lurking at the edge of my property, half hidden in the tree line. He was snapping photos of the gathering and tapping away at his phone, likely preparing his next stack of HOA violations. But residents saw him too, and their expressions told me they were starting to grasp just how closely the HOA monitored their every move. Once spotted, Clark retreated toward the community center, but not before taking one last photo of the families enjoying my illuminated dock. As people began to head home, Harold pulled me aside, his expression serious. "Frank fought the HOA once," he said quietly. "Took them to court. Won, but the board never forgave him." Then, lowering his voice, he added something that made my stomach tighten. He had once seen Victoria at the Marina, marking areas with red tape, a detail that tied her directly to the boundary manipulations I was just beginning to piece together. The last of the families drifted back toward the community center as I switched off the string lights, taking a moment to absorb the success of the spontaneous gathering. For the first time since moving in, I truly felt like I'd built a real connection with my neighbors. Several even thanked me personally for giving them access to a part of the waterfront they had never been able to enjoy before. While clearing away the grill and folding chairs, I noticed an official-looking envelope tucked under my door during the festivities. Inside was a notice from Victoria, a mandatory community inspection scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning, with special attention to unauthorized gatherings and safety concerns tied to unsupervised waterfront use. The timing spoke for itself. But Harold wasn't finished dropping hints. Leaning in close, he whispered, "You might want to look at those land deeds again." Frank left more than just the docks. Monday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes everything feel bleak and unwelcoming, fitting for what I suspected would be my final showdown with Victoria and the HOA board. The inspection order required attendance at the community center at precisely 8 a.m. I watched neighbors trudge across the slick pavement, their faces showing resignation. None of them wanted to be there, but skipping it meant risking consequences. I'd spent Sunday night carefully organizing every piece of documentation connected to my property purchase, including the new evidence my lawyer friend had uncovered about exclusive easements and waterfront rights. Victoria sat at the head table like a judge presiding over a courtroom, with Clark and 2 other board members at her side. Around them were stacks of bankers' boxes filled with files, an intimidating display meant to discourage opposition. Clark had even set up a large easel bearing a property map, though from my seat in the back the details were too small to make out. Victoria opened the meeting with a recital from a thick folder she called the official HOA bylaws and covenants. According to her interpretation, private waterfront structures, including my pier, fell under community authority whenever they were deemed necessary for marina operations and resident safety. She displayed faded photocopies of supposed legal precedents and municipal codes to back up her case. It was an elaborate presentation, but I quickly noticed every document was a poor quality reproduction with no official seals or county stamps. When I asked to see the originals, she brushed me off, saying they were stored securely for protection. Clark's part of the show centered on safety claims. He pointed at areas on his easel diagram, insisting my pier created navigation hazards and blocked emergency routes. He produced inspection reports and compliance evaluations that branded my pier a danger to the community. But when I pressed him on who had conducted these inspections and when, his answers grew vague, hiding behind talk of professional standards and certified procedures. That's usually when you know someone's bluffing. The tension peaked when Victoria declared the HOA had retained legal counsel and was ready to sue if I didn't sign a pier access agreement by week's end. She produced a threatening letter from a law firm, full of warnings about property seizure and financial penalties. Yet when I asked her to cite the specific authority that allowed a HOA to take my land, she deflected into vague claims about eminent domain and community welfare. It was clear the whole performance was meant to intimidate, but the threat of litigation was serious enough to push the conflict to its breaking point. I let them finish, calmly taking notes, then rose to respond. Instead of arguing emotionally, I used the steady, methodical approach I'd relied on throughout my logistics career. I laid out 3 old deeds on the table, handing copies to each board member so everyone could see. "These aren't just historical papers," I said firmly, locking eyes with Victoria. "They're enforceably signed, sealed, and still in effect." The deeds and chain of title documents established not only my ownership of the pier but also the submerged land surrounding it, granting me exclusive control over water access, something Victoria clearly hadn't expected. Unlike her blurry photocopies, my evidence bore county seals, notarized signatures, and surveyor reports going back to the original lake development in the 1960s. I explained the concept of exclusive easements in plain language so every resident could understand, emphasizing that these rights predated the HOA's existence and could not be overturned by internal covenants. When Victoria tried to interrupt, I reminded her that recorded easements take precedence over HOA bylaws in every state. The turning point came when I produced a waterline survey marking the exact boundaries of my access rights. The GPS coordinates aligned perfectly with the boundary marker I had uncovered behind my cabin, and the description even outlined marina maintenance responsibilities and liability coverage. I asked Victoria how the HOA planned to provide alternative public access if they seized my pier. For the first time, she fell silent. Then, in frustration, she snapped, "You had no right to access those files." Her words confirmed she had believed the records were hidden. Clark blundered further, blurting out, "You said no one would find those folders." His outburst exposed their collusion and proved they had been deliberately withholding information from the community. The meeting unraveled. Residents began asking about the Marina repair fund and the missing money. Megan Price called out from the middle row, demanding to know why no actual improvements had been made despite months of special assessments. A woman in the back stood up, shouting that they had fined her father for nothing more than painting his mailbox blue. Victoria tried to shut the meeting down, but the residents weren't ready to stop. They wanted answers about their money and their rights. I closed my folder and prepared to leave, knowing the evidence I'd presented was solid and undeniable. Yet I could already see in Victoria's eyes that she was planning her next move, unwilling to face the reality of what those deeds meant. The evidence I had presented had already exposed the weakness in the HOA's claims, but it also made one thing clear: Victoria wasn't going to walk away without escalating the fight. Quietly, I pulled out one last envelope from my folder, its label bold enough for everyone nearby to read: Marina title transfer notarized. The sudden silence in the room told me that every eye was now fixed on me, waiting to see what was inside. That evening, an unexpected turn came when Victoria announced an emergency community meeting, and not at the clubhouse as usual, but at my dock. The notice slipped into everyone's mailbox was short and urgent: final resolution of pier dispute, attendance mandatory at 7 p.m. at waterfront property. The venue change struck me as unusual. Victoria always preferred the authority of sitting at the head table inside the community center. Holding it outside, on my pier, would normally put her at a disadvantage, or so I thought. Then it hit me: she likely intended to use the dramatic outdoor setting as a backdrop for her final move. The sun was sinking behind the tall pines when the neighbors gathered, casting the dock in golden light that would have been perfect for a friendly gathering under different circumstances. Victoria arrived with Clark, the entire HOA board, and a sharply dressed attorney who introduced himself as their legal counsel. They were clearly prepared for confrontation, carrying thick folders and wearing grim, determined expressions. More residents had turned up for this meeting than any before, drawn by the promise of a final resolution and the curiosity of seeing how it would all unfold. Wasting no time, Victoria declared that their attorney had completed the legal review and found that my pier fell under community authority, subject to maritime access rules that overrode private property claims. Refusing community use, she said, meant I was interfering with navigational easements, and they were prepared to take me to court unless I surrendered access voluntarily. Their lawyer stepped forward with a heavy folder of documents, insisting they had proof the pier was part of community assets dating back to the county's original development permits. He gave me exactly 5 minutes to review the material before deciding whether to sign their access agreement. I flipped through the folder, pretending to study it, though I already knew what I'd find are the same flimsy covenants and recycled bylaws Victoria had been waving around for weeks. along with permits that referred to general marina construction but not specific pier ownership. Several crucial details had been overlooked. When my time was up, I stepped to the center of the dock so everyone could see me clearly. "Before I respond to your legal threads," I said, locking eyes with Victoria before addressing the crowd, "let me ask a simple question, one your lawyer should be able to answer. Does your claim to this pier include any of the submerged land beneath it?" Victoria shifted uneasily, while her lawyer hesitated before replying. The HOA's position is based on surface rights and covenants, not the underlying property. That falls under county authority. "Exactly," I said with a nod. From my jacket pocket, I drew the sealed envelope that everyone had seen me holding at the last meeting. The tension was palpable as I opened it and revealed the first document, a deed transfer showing that last spring, the entire Lakeview Marina had been sold by Morrison Holdings LLC to my property management company. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Only Harold seemed unsurprised, nodding as if he had suspected this all along. I explained that Frank Morrison hadn't just owned the pier and cabin I purchased it, he had owned every dock slip, access point, and waterfront structure in the marina for more than 3 decades. Then I produced the second document, even more devastating to Victoria's argument, a liability insurance policy showing the HOA had been paying me monthly premiums for marina maintenance and emergency coverage since the day I closed the deal. By state code and easement law, the land was exempt from HOA control. The HOA, I continued, was classified only as a tenant organization with limited coordination rights and not as owners or managers of the marina itself. Victoria's face drained of color as I read aloud, while her lawyer frantically shuffled through his papers, searching for a rebuttal that didn't exist. The neighbors reacted immediately. Megan stepped forward and said sharply, "You let her bully us all this time, and we never knew the truth." Harold raised a finger and added, "I warned them years ago that Frank's rights were ironclad. Now it's out in the open." Former supporters of Victoria began to question why they had never been told about the insurance payments or the real ownership structure. Even Harold's wife, who had never spoken at a meeting before, demanded to know why the board had been collecting marina repair funds for a property they didn't own. Panic set in for Victoria. One board member quietly removed his HOA badge, dropped it on the dock, and walked away, unwilling to be part of the lie any longer. Victoria tried to argue that the documents were misunderstood, but a resident live streaming the meeting cut her off. "Keep talking, we're recording everything." That silenced her immediately. Clark made one last desperate attempt, claiming my paperwork was forged. The accusation was so absurd that several neighbors laughed out loud, and even Victoria looked embarrassed by his outburst. I calmly offered certified copies to anyone who wanted verification and invited their lawyer to confirm everything with the county records office. Defeated, the attorney gathered his materials and slipped away without a word. As the meeting ended, I made a proposal I had been considering since the weekend's gathering. Rather than dealing with HOA fees and endless bureaucracy, I would establish direct agreements with residents who wanted marina access, cutting out the association entirely and eliminating the $200 seasonal fees Victoria had been planning to impose. As I walked through the dispersing crowd, someone whispered, "You saved this place." I didn't respond. I simply kept walking toward the dock. Finally, completely mine. The next morning, the news spread. Victoria had resigned as HOA president, effective immediately. Clark and 2 other board members also stepped down. Their resignation letters, delivered in official HOA stationery, carried a noticeably different tone than Victoria's usual commanding style. Instead of grand proclamations, they offered short, defensive statements about irreconcilable differences in leadership philosophy and external pressures that made governance impossible. Reading between the lines, it was clear the moment the residents learned the truth about marina ownership and the mishandled finances, Victoria's support evaporated completely. In an emergency vote, Harold Green was chosen as interim HOA president. That evening, the newly appointed president opened his term by ordering a complete audit of all HOA financial records going back 3 years. The firm he brought in specialized in forensic reviews of non-profit organizations, and even their initial findings were more damaging than I had anticipated. The preliminary report revealed that the HOA's Marina Repair Fund had collected more than $120,000 in special assessments and maintenance fees since Victoria assumed leadership. Yet, only about $30,000 could be traced to legitimate marina-related expenses. The remainder had been tucked away under vague categories like administrative consulting and emergency infrastructure planning, thinly disguised labels for personal spending and unauthorized fund transfers. The audit didn't stop there. It uncovered widespread misuse of association money that reached far beyond the Marina Fund. Victoria had routinely charged personal expenses to HOA credit cards, everything from dining out and vacations to upgrades on her own home. Meanwhile, Clark had been collecting monthly payments for so-called security consulting. Despite having no license or credentials in the field, the board had approved these expenses without scrutiny, relying solely on Victoria's explanations. Once the audit results became public, legal action moved quickly. The county prosecutor opened a criminal investigation into embezzlement and the misappropriation of community funds. Victoria was ordered to repay over $90,000 in unauthorized spending, while Clark faced similar demands for restitution along with possible charges of intimidation and harassment tied back to him through phone records and witness testimony. Even the HOA's attorney stepped away, stating he'd been misled about the legal foundation of the disputes. The most satisfying moment came when the new board issued me a formal letter of apology. They admitted that my property rights had been violated and acknowledged that their former leadership had acted without legal authority. The letter also included a request that I consider entering into a marina access arrangement, one that respected my easement while allowing the community to benefit. I agreed, but only under terms that recognize the true ownership structure. Under the revised system, residents could enjoy free access to the marina if they volunteered for maintenance and followed safety guidelines. Almost immediately, the community atmosphere shifted. Neighbors who had once avoided me began waving and apologizing for believing Victoria's lies without hearing my side. Megan Price became one of my strongest allies, organizing cleanup days and managing the volunteer schedule that kept the facilities in better condition than they had been in years. Harold's long memory of the community's history proved invaluable in shaping maintenance routines that balanced tradition with practicality. 6 months later, the new access program was running smoothly. Participation was high, lake access was finally affordable, and the transparent decision-making process gave residents a real voice in how things were run. I even replaced the old private pier sign with one that read, "Community access by owner permission," a symbol of the cooperative spirit we'd built. Standing on the pier at sunset, watching families fish and laugh where battles had once been fought, I felt relief more than pride. The wind carried not just the warmth of summer, but the quiet reassurance that the struggle had been worth it. I pulled out my phone to capture the moment, but before hitting record, my hand brushed against Frank's old brass key in my pocket. Maybe that's the lesson. Some things aren't meant to be owned or controlled, but cared for and passed on. If you've ever had to defend something bigger than yourself, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this one resonated with you, supporting the channel through the thanks button below helps us keep going. Take care of your little corner of the world. You never know who might need it more than you. Thanks for sticking with your stories. Don't forget to hit the bell because things are only going to get wilder from here.